Hello and welcome to the Genuine Learning Blog. My name is Melissa Galasso and I'm excited to have you here with me today to talk about a new non-authoritative guidance coming out of the AICPA. And this one has to do with materiality and attest engagements, but in particular, those that are of the subject matter that cannot be quantitatively measured. So when we think about a financial statement, right, it's very easy to come up with materiality. We can base it off of assets or revenue. But when we look at attest engagements, the subject matter can be very broad and as a result, not necessarily quantitative. And so how do you know if something is materially misstated if you don't know what's material to the item? And so as we look at this, examinations and reviews, both under the attest standards, require the consideration of materiality in slightly different ways, but you have to consider materiality as part of it. But when the subject matter is not a financial statement, it makes it a little bit harder. So as a result, this was really trying to provide some, again, non-authoritative guidance for these types of engagements. So this comes out of ASEC, the Assurance Services Executive Committee, and in particular, the Materiality Working Group. So they put together a series of professionals along with AICPA staff. Now, this is non-authoritative guidance, and so this is not subject to rules and regulations by the AICPA. In fact, it's not been even necessarily approved by the AICPA or the Auditing Standards Board. It is just the interpretation of the members of the Standards Setting Committee and the staff. But I will tell you, the people who worked on this on behalf of the staff are the people who are involved in standard setting. So you can feel pretty confident when you're reading it that it's pretty good guidance. So the concept here is a material misstatement. And a material misstatement on a financial statement is a little bit easier. So what do we look at when we're looking at an attest engagement? So the attest standards define a misstatement as the difference between the measurement or evaluation of the subject matter by the responsible party and the proper measurement or evaluation of the subject matter on the criteria, based on the criteria. And so as a result, we have to evaluate it compared to this criteria that we're going to be using. But again, it can be very varied in terms of the subject matter, and that's what creates difficulty. And so when we have a misstatement, when is it material? You'll notice some influence here from SAS 138. Misstatements are considered to be material if there is a substantial likelihood that individually or in the aggregate, they would influence the judgment made by intended users based on the subject matter. So really, it's a user concept here. And obviously the switch from could to would, consistent with the changes to the standards here. So we've had updates to the definition of materiality that are in the attest standards as well as in the audit standards. And so as a result, that's going to be a key element. So when we are thinking about materiality, what are we going to think about when it's potentially in, for example, a narrative presentation? So someone's making a statement, or they're posting something, they're claiming something about sustainability or working conditions. How do we evaluate that? And so we are going to consider any expectations that we have based on the content, based on their understanding of the subject matter and related disclosures, and whether disclosures about certain aspects are more likely to be important to intended users. So going back to that concept of what is the user trying to use this document for? Why are we giving an assertion? Why are we attesting at all? And so when we look at this, we think about the types of qualitative considerations. What's the significant aspect of the subject matter, right? The practitioner's perception of the needs of the intended user. What are they going to be using this for? And then put more emphasis on those. What have we communicated to the intended user, right? So if we're aware that the entity has made a statement to the user, then that communication can help us evaluate materiality. So the example that they use is if a company says that 100% of their ingredients are organic, and just one ingredient is not organic, is that material? Well, it depends on what the claim is saying. And so that 100% claim might make one ingredient, right, depending on what it is, to be material. And so those are the types of things that they're looking at. We also want to understand the relationship, right? So whether the misstatement relates to the relationship between management and other parties, are there sort of related party types of considerations? And then contractual or regulatory, right? So is there an element of non-compliance? So when a misstatement could affect compliance with a contract, law, or regulation, what would be the impact of non-compliance? What could the impact be? So obviously there are a lot of things that we have to consider. Another one is when we're trying to decide what is material, the amount of uncertainty related to it. So you have to perform more procedures in order to get that sufficient appropriate evidence. So again, when there are errors that have in the process have been identified, you might have to do more work to get more comfortable with whether or not the potential amount is going to be material. So they do provide some guidance on evaluation, and when you have to evaluate whether you have these identified misstatements, are they material? Because just having a finding or an item doesn't mean it's a material misstatement. So you have to take that evaluation. So you have to consider your expectations or thresholds that were identified during the risk assessment process, whether the misstatements result in the failure to meet the specific criteria, right? So when we look at it in terms of as a whole, is this going to be indicative of a material misstatement on the subject matter? Qualitative factors, which are already listed in the attest standards, just being applied to this subject matter. And then the effective misstatement on the subject matter, considering the criteria taken as a whole. So this is sort of some of the guides. And what I will tell you is this is really just the kind of highlights. It's a very long document. It's about, I think, 30 pages, but they use a lot of examples. And so one of the things I would recommend is look at the examples, even if they're not the examples that you would be using or the types of engagements you have, you can kind of make it by analogy. And that's what I really liked about this document, was the analogy element to it. So one of the things that they look at is something, is there sort of a commonality? Is there a thread that's sort of giving this concept of materiality? So evaluate the aggregate effect of uncorrected individually immaterial misstatements involved looking, is there a commonality? So we would aggregate financial statement misstatements until we could tell, in aggregate, were they material? Same thing here. Is there a commonality between them that would then say, this is going to be a material item? And so there's a little bit of guidance there about how you evaluate this. And sometimes even if it's not common, you can still end up determining that it is material just because of the pervasiveness of it. All right, so that's a wrap on today's blog. Again, high-level introduction, really well-written document, not authoritative, but definitely helpful for those entities working on these types of engagements. So thank you for joining me, and I hope to see you on a future blog. Have a great day, guys. Bye-bye.